This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, where, given my love for the Beatles and their music, which of course is familiar to every listener of this show, it seemed very appropriate that I should feature someone who's an expert on the Beatles, in particular on John and Paul and what became of them. Her name will also be familiar to listeners to the show. She's from Toronto. She has a background in art history, medieval and art and literature, history, very broad background, and in my opinion has a simply excellent mind. So it's a very great pleasure for me to have Clare Kuehn back on the show. Clare, welcome back to The Real Deal.
Thanks, Jim.
Clare, are you?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Did you miss my?
I said.
Oh, I couldn't hear any of it. I didn't hear you say.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, let's.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah. Let's hope we don't have any Skype problems today.
Okay.
Listen, Clare, as you know so very well, I deal with all these complex and controversial issues: 9/11, JFK, Wellstone, Sandy Hook, the Boston bombing, and a host of others. But I've seldom seen a reaction such as we have had to your discussions of the idea that Paul McCartney was killed in 1966 and then replaced by someone who was a very close approximation and who turned out to be a very talented songwriter and singer as well on his own behalf. For some reason, that generates about as profound a response as any discussion about the multiple shooters of JFK or the involvement of the CIA and the Mossad in 9/11. What's going on here?
Well, what do you think, first of all, might be going on so that I can reply rather than just share?
My thoughts? Well, I mean, I think a lot of people just think it's far-fetched because the Beatles are so public. They think it's so very difficult that it should happen. And I myself, of course, shared that kind of skepticism in the beginning. And it's only through a rather lengthy process that, and especially encountering the forensic evidence related to differences in their height and features of their jaw, their teeth, if we could get good comparisons, no doubt it would include their ears and other issues like that have brought me around to take the thesis seriously. And similar things can be said of Don Fox, who also, like myself, was very skeptical in the beginning. But now he and I both are inclined to believe that you're on the right track here. And yet, anytime it's ever mentioned or whenever you're posting on the radiofetzer.blogspot.com blog, you're attacked for having an interest in this question, which, given the enormous popularity of the Beatles, I mean, I think that also has to do with the dimensions of the emotional reaction. I mean, in many ways, this is regarded by some, at least emotionally, as on a par with the assassination of JFK or the attacks of 9/11.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, to be honest, as I said in the first broadcast I did with your group, I went through the same thing. In fact, I took the attitude, maybe not quite as virulent as some of the people on the forum, but I took the attitude that I didn't really even know that anybody took it as a serious concept. I thought that, for the most part, it was a question of, did they plant any weird ideas, and could that be proven at all? I didn't even go the route of, well, that would mean Paul died, right? Like, I just thought, I saw these things that people said, yeah, Paul McCartney, you listen to this backwards, and Paul's dead, and it's like, yeah, okay, that's stupid. And also people were spoofing the idea by drawing stars and pentagrams and all kinds of things on, or squares and circles all over Abbey Road and saying, see, I can see any picture I want to. I thought that was a bit extreme because the kinds of things that people were saying they saw were not of the, just reading anything in. I mean, there were sort of strange interrelated seeming concepts anyway that were coming up. So I just thought it was a public misunderstanding and maybe a hoax, right? So I didn't start into this as somebody who, first of all, had a massive impression that they were different. And I also didn't start in as somebody who was radically against it, but I thought it was silly. I actually thought it would be an easy thing to debunk. And same as ultimate, you mentioned the forensic work that was done. We'll get to that. They too, in their professional opinions, they did on a lark. They thought, well, this will be easy to disprove with our science. So I was thinking it would be easy to disprove with my knowledge of comparative thematics, comparative history. You know, like what are symbols? How do they share? How do people make mistakes? And what we've been dealing with about the 9/11 stuff, what is going too far? What can you disprove fairly well versus what is partly right or what is very, as you called it, counterintuitive, but turns out to be true? I mean, it is a hard thing to determine if you're not willing to look at it.
Well, let me draw a parallel with a comparable case. I mean, surprisingly comparable, which concerns the death of Saddam Hussein. I was contacted, many years ago by the mother of a B-1 bomber pilot who'd been on a run in Iraq when he was given a call for special coordinates, told this was the big one, dropped 2 500-pound JDAM bombs on a restaurant on the outskirts of Baghdad. When he returned to base, he was lionized because he'd taken out Saddam Hussein, his 2 sons, and 50 or 60 members of his general staff.
Terrible, but true.
Yeah, and they had the military. We had known where he was by tracking his cell phones. He had custom-made Jaguar cell phones that were made in the UK, and it was possible to track him. So when they got to the coordinates, they took advantage of it. His name was Chris Wachter, Wachter. His mother Yvonne. And I have featured her on shows here several times. I've also published several articles because it was the death of Saddam Hussein only about 3 weeks into the invasion of Iraq. It may have been April 7th, but it was around that date that this occurred already, and it was the cause for initiating the mission accomplished ceremony on the USS Lincoln off of the coast of San Diego. It was only when someone in the administration, and we conjecture it was probably Donald Rumsfeld, realized that 3 presidents, Carter, Ford, and Reagan, as I recall, had signed executive orders against the assassination of a foreign leader, that they realized belatedly that by celebrating the assassination of Saddam Hussein, they'd be admitting the commission of a crime by George W. Bush, and therefore the whole thing, was compromised. They couldn't really report what the mission was they'd accomplished, and it turned out to be a bit of a fiasco, where Bush flew in purportedly in a plane, landing on the carrier, didn't detach his flight suit. I mean, he looked a little silly, but the whole thing became a cause of much embarrassment. Now, after Chris Wachter was feted in the Crystal Cathedral in Anaheim in Orange County, which is one of the most conservative counties in the country, by the Reverend Robert Schiller, whose programs are televised nationally, and was honored for having taken out Saddam Hussein. The day following that broadcast, he was directed to fly back to Washington to CIA headquarters in Langley and explain that while they admired his flying skills, that officially Saddam had got away. And, of course, they would replace him with one of his doubles, where Saddam had, several, who was allegedly found in a spider hole underground. I mean, Saddam Hussein, the ruler of this magnificent ancient civilization, would never have deigned to climb into a dirt hole. And the whole thing went forward with one of this double, where Saddam's wife, for example, when the Red Cross finally obtained permission for her to visit, came out yelling, this is not my husband. What have you done with my husband? This is not my husband. And when an Australian investigative journalist, Joe Vials, if that's the correct pronunciation, Vials, as I recall, had observed that, Saddam didn't have the right facial features, the new Saddam, the guy that was being put on trial, as the original. When I went about verifying what he had observed, I obtained a copy of the official photograph of Saddam Hussein from the pack of 52 cards that the U.S. in Iraq was using, and the ace of spades was Saddam Hussein, and I compared him, and he had a magnificent set of teeth, and he had as I recall, a slight overbite, whereas the substitute had terrible teeth and an underbite. I mean, they weren't the same guy. Yeah. So, thinking about your case.
And then there's Bin Laden, and people just can't get over that, fat, thin, tall. But those are political ones, and so this seems a little strange.
Yeah, but when you talk about the amount of money, I mean, you're talking about a big business. I mean, this is the most popular band in the world, making I don't know what their total take has been of the Beatles, but it's got to be in the billions of dollars. I mean, they may have sold more albums than anyone else, although I know today there may be some competition. But, it's a big deal, very big deal. I think when they lost Paul, the question was the whole band thing going to fall apart? Were they going to lose, this huge success? Which was making all these brilliant contributions. I'll tell you, Claire, the strongest argument in my own mind against there having been a substitution was that the replacement, shall we call him Fall, F-A-U-L?
I call him Sir Paul because that is actually his public name, and I do that out of, in spite of my distaste for the situation, respect for the fifth Beatle, if he is.
Well, it's hard to...
So let's call him Sir Paul.
All right.
Let's call him Sir Paul. I mean, he is a guy, and he was a Beatle. If he's a different guy, for the audience...
He's not only that. He's not only that, but and this was the most difficult, obstacle for me to accept the idea. He's also a brilliant musician. Because, I mean, this
Some
guy...
say not so much, others say better. So, but...
But the point is, Claire, he's in he's in a class that's exceptional. He's brilliant and creative. I mean, just think of what he did with Wings after...
I think that's his best.
After the Beatles had broken up. I mean, what he did with Wings all by itself tells you that this guy is an incredibly talented musician. And I've seen him perform live, really was it Jay Leno or David Letterman? He was on the top of the marquee, doing a free show in New York City. I mean, the guy's a tremendous talent. Now, he's lost a lot of his voice, it seems to me. I don't think today he's what he used to be. But, I mean, the idea that you could have two individuals who look so very much alike, barring the differences we're going to discuss, and that they should both be so creative and so forth. I mean... that was the big obstacle in my mind, and it was the forensic evidence that pushed me over the edge to be convinced that, as in the case of Saddam Hussein, as in the case of Osama, and that's a very appropriate parallel to draw as well, that we should...
And Stalin. Stalin's double has just been officially declassified, and he's not that similar, but it was in the days before plastic surgery, and he said... I mean, he's very similar, but he has a kind of a recessive chin, and as he said, his biggest challenge was his ears. And his movements were the most important thing. By moving like Stalin, even though he was 25 and Stalin was, I think, 50 when he started, he fooled even close aides. This says something, I hope, to people that it's not impossible that they may be fooled. It doesn't mean they have been, but that they may be fooled.
Well, Saddam had multiple doubles, and, you look at the guy who was purportedly hung, and I think there are real questions as to whether or not that actually took place. In other words, they could have had a platform there, so when he appeared to be hung, he was actually on the platform, or what may be even more likely, although they made promises to him that they were only going to stage the hanging, they went ahead and actually hung him. I mean, he knew too much. Yeah. What if this guy turns up somewhere, right? Wandering?
Right, I know.
So the whole thing is blown.
You don't want friends in the mafia. Yeah, exactly.
And this is a huge deal politically. I mean, the whole phony trial of Saddam Hussein. And I still have people who have trouble dealing with it. You know, I actually got on to the Ed Schultz show right before noon. I mean, I had to wait for 45 minutes before I got on the air. And he had me on for about 5 minutes, and I started talking about the case, sketching about as much as I have here, about how the B-1 bomber pilot, you know, had taken him out in this restaurant in Baghdad, in that even Dick Cheney had acknowledged his body had been dragged out of the rubble and that he'd been lionized on CNN. In fact, he would subsequently be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. And Ed Schultz said to me, you know, because they had to go to the break over the noon hour, and he said, we'll be right back with the rest of the story. You know, I mean, it was like he was very excited. Then I stayed on my cell phone for an hour and a half, Claire, waiting for him to bring me back on. And, of course, he wasn't going to do it. So I wound up publishing an article about it, you know, about Ed Schultz being himself a gatekeeper, which is very disappointing because so many of us think he does so much good. But in this case,
may have gotten to him in the break.
Absolutely. He was, because he initially seemed to be very excited, actually, about what I had to say. So I published about that, too. So if you go on to Veterans Today, you know, go to Veterans Today, comment Jim Fetzer, you get a link to my archives, and put in Mission Accomplished or Ed Schultz, and you get, I don't know, there might be 4 or 5 articles about this there now. But you can also go to radiofetzer.blogspot and just do a search on Yvonne, Y-V-O-N-N-E, Wachter, W-A-C-H-T-E-R, and you'll see I have multiple interviews with her. She's a terrific woman.
Yeah.
And Claire, you know, what was fascinating about Yvonne when she first contacted me and told me about the story, I said how fascinating I found that. But I needed some kind of documentation, substantiation. She turned out to be a genius at research. And she started sending me article after article and, you know, one form of support after another form of support. And I archived a whole lot of them right on 911scholars.org. So if you go down to the bottom where, you know, the research archive there, if you go into the Mission Accomplished fiasco, you'll find about a dozen or 12 links to articles. They try to delete these things, of course, the government, as soon as it realizes you've figured something out. They go about erasing it, but, you know, we got the Crystal Cathedral. I mean, how can you beat that? Footage in the Crystal Cathedral where this world-famous minister is honoring...
And then it goes into the memory hole of nobody knows, and it's gone, right?
Well, no, we've been able to preserve that. I mean, we've still got that.
Only because you were I'm just saying it goes into the general memory hole. Yeah.
Well, you know, it's amazing to me that as much as I published about this, it has got more attention. I had it included in a short piece entitled 9/11, Were We Bamboozled?, which I included the second death of Osama bin Laden because the whole raid on the compound in Pakistan is a fantasy. And the first death of Saddam Hussein. And then, of course, the claim that the towers collapsed, which is complete rubbish. And I think the final was that saying about the Pentagon, you know, that no plane hit the Pentagon. I mean, those are 4 biggies where we've been told whoppers by our government.
Yeah.
Well, you have such an open, flexible mind, you know, but you have one of the best analytical minds that I know, Claire. I mean, you're really good at all this, and you tend to adopt a higher order perspective in sizing up arguments and seeing how the elements of evidence fit together, which is one of the reasons why I find you such a valuable contributor to radiofetzer.blogspot.com, to the blogs there about the different shows.
Thanks, because what some people start to say is, you know, flights of wording or flights of language, but actually it's flights of logic. If you're aware of the different levels of argument and where things can go wonky and why they do and how to avoid it, but how to stay open just in case, there's more there. So to put it on the back burner, but, you know, not really deal with it until maybe another piece comes in that would confirm it. I think people forget that in some of these.
Well, I think you know, in relation to most of those, well, all of those who attack you and don't take what you have done here seriously. I mean, I just think you have a superior intellect, and, you know, sometimes your explanations yes, they often use a lot of words, and you could be accused of being verbose, but the same thing is sometimes, or could be said of me, just because we're being thorough and painstaking and saying things in a precise manner so that they're true. I mean, I don't think that's
right.
I don't think that's a fault. I think that's a virtue. But there are those.
I try to put it all in because it's there for posterity, and therefore, even if someone has a hard time reading through it, at least technically it's been said. If otherwise there's still misunderstandings, but technically I can say, I said that, right?
Yeah.
And so.
Yeah.
Well, I think you're right about the political doubles. I think that and one can make a case that doubles are more common than one might think in security and intelligence work than some people think. Also, false identities, just the same person with different names. It's not exactly doubles, but, the issue would be for the Beatles, some people kind of go simple stupid on it. I don't mean to totally insult, but let's just sort of label it emotionally, that they're just a band. And they're just a band, and they're just musicians. People do that to artists, right? They're just musicians, and they were into their music, and they were fun, and they were this and that, and you're saying that they, not only conceived of this whole thing, which I'm not actually positing they did, but they also went for it. They betrayed a friend. They continued with it. Life was fine, and this is a switcheroo, and these are the impressions, right? And it's just a band. How could they do it? Why would they do it?
That's of course what Sir Paul said after the breakup, and there was such a huge public response. He said, well, it was just a band.
Right. Well, I mean, it's true in one way, right? But
the greatest band in history, the greatest source of popular music of all time, a real true musical genius. I compare them in their finest moments with Mozart. I mean, they are absolutely sensational, and they deserve all those accolades. I mean, which is one of the reasons, of course, why I use them as a framework for my show. They are wonderful.
Well, I think that as band members, musicians, and political public, shall we say, figures, John and Sir Paul, and just to distinguish him from the potential, he's the same, not the same. They were also trying to say, get a life. We are not only what you thought we were. We're people. We move on. We do other music. So it's okay to say, I don't believe in Beatles, as John did, or, hey, we're just a band, let us break up. That's a different thing than the public people now saying they were just a band, nothing like this would be done. It's also because, as you said, they were at the peak of their career if this happened in late 1966. They were actually, for their early touring stuff, they had, reached a climax of Beatlemania. It actually would never be seen again in that way because they stopped touring. And also, they were a huge who knows about hundreds of millions of dollars in those dollars, but and they lost a lot of it personally, by the way, through siphoning off. Epstein, their manager, was siphoning, and other things were going on. And they lost control of their songs, a lot of it. But you're right, in total, for other people, they've made hundreds of billions, or who knows, trillions.
Why would anyone think, however, that they planned? I mean, they lost a member of their band, and we'll talk about how that may have come about, but I mean, then they had to cope. What do you do if Paul's dead? I mean, what do you do? They had to cope with it. And they had, a lot of people giving them advice. I think there's no doubt about it, but it was held in super secrecy. I think that's also obvious.
Well, if he was replaced, I'll be fair to the audience, if he was replaced, then all of that would be true. But the types of objections are they're just a band, who cares, they're not smart enough, or other bands continue with a new lineup. What's the problem?
Oh, but Claire, that's perfectly silly. Listen, we're going to take a break. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my special guest today, Clare Kuehn. We're talking about the Beatles, especially Paul and John. We'll be right back.
Even Bush admits that Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11. Our own FBI acknowledged it has no hard evidence that ties Osama bin Laden to 9/11. But if Saddam had nothing to do with 9/11, And if Osama had nothing to do with 9/11, then who did? Who did it? The 9/11 conspiracy provides the answer. Discover the big picture. Learn what we know now. Find out what it means. 11 experts contribute to exposing the truth as the anatomy of an atrocity. Edited by James H. Fetzer. Buy it now if you have the courage to face the truth. Just don't think you're going to like it. The 9/11 conspiracy provides the answer.
This is Jim Fetzer, your host, continuing my conversation with Clare Kuehn. Clare, before the break, we were talking about those who want to dismiss the issue as unimportant because it's just a band, and I think you wanted to add some additional thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, I was moving towards the idea that other bands have had other lineups, and they continued, and Genesis changed and all that. We have to remember that whether or not the Beatles, as they were, Fab Four, incredible phenomenon, tight harmonies, very tight group of friends, whether they would have felt they couldn't continue is part of it, because it's not only whether they could have. When people are under a pressure, they, just like the perps of 9/11 or whatever, evil or not so evil, for the Beatles here in this scenario, if they feel that it would work or they feel it wouldn't work, those will be decisions, right? It's not just whether you think, well, they could have just faked 103 minutes of, let's say, of the 9/11 footage. Yeah, nice and easy. Would they have felt they would do that and so on is part of the issue. Same thing here. If the Beatles had lost a bandmate, particularly not Ringo or George, whom I'm not slamming at all. In fact, I think that without them, it would be a diminished, very diminished band. But if somebody died, which is not an impossible thing to have happen in life, if somebody died, who would be the person who, or the two people who probably would stand more for the Beatles if they continued? It'd be John and Paul. And as such, which one, if one died, or as you have raised in other broadcasts, some people raise the even more strange concept, shall we say, that Paul might have been murdered by some method, say a car or something else, then who would be easier in the public mind to sort of replace? Not that he wasn't unique, not that he wasn't a rockin', jazzy, bluesy player, incredible friend, but it would be harder to mimic John's outgoing person. He was.
What you mean, more idiosyncratic personality?
Idiosyncratic. Now, let's say they could have. I mean, again, people have been mirroring John over the years. There have been people who do it, and maybe the public would fall for it. Again, the issue is, what would if there were perpetrators or murderers, what would they think? Again, it doesn't prove, our discussion here, honestly, audience, does not prove any of this. What we're doing is opening the issue as, is it at all conceivable, even if it wasn't done and it's absolutely stupid to think so? Is there something that could have made it happen? And I don't think the Beatles would have felt, or their lawyers, or their backers, or the Queen, or the Lords, and so on in England. They were quite an economic commodity. Or the people in the Americas would have felt they probably could have continued with a different lineup. I don't think that would have felt like the Beatles to the public, and I think they probably felt that way if Paul died. So what I'd like to lead with, but I still would love you to ask me questions, is this issue of how we got here. Because we can lead with the forensics. Many people go, I want to know the forensics, but I've found if we discuss the forensics before people actually know how you get there, just as in a court case, they often don't listen through very carefully forensics that they do not understand or want to see yet. So the issue is how we got here is most people assume and think that this was one of two types of things. A pure myth made up in the public, so it's not involving the Beatles at all, really, or a hoax of some kind. could be a mythological idea of death, rebirth, transformation, deep changes, drugs, whatever. Could be a hoaxy joke, ploy, extended, weird, even macabre, sick. They blame John for that.
Or some kind of PR gimmick.
A PR gimmick, a money ploy, something like that, some combination. Or just a weird, funny, silly thing because these guys were kind of funny, right? But when you move from, it's a pure public myth purely, like it's not just a public myth as in a public untruth, it's a public creation, to the idea it's a hoax, you've made two transitions, which I'd like to remind the audience of. One is you've actually moved from whether the Beatles were not involved to whether they were involved. You move from it's purely myth to it's a hoax. You've also moved from it's purely myth, and that means certain things about psychology of the public, to assuming certain results about if the Beatles were involved. You've eliminated in that switch that Paul was replaced. So you've done two things. You've moved from the Beatles weren't involved to the Beatles were involved. You've also moved to only one type of explanation for if the Beatles were involved. So the first thing to determine is, were the Beatles involved? Just even, were they involved? Never mind why, never mind whatever. Were they involved in any of this? Can you actually directly prove they had any role at all?
Well, Claire, it seems to me you are getting one step ahead of the game in the following way. When you talk about the Beatles involved, that doesn't imply they were involved in Paul's death. The question is, were they involved in once Paul died, in not breaking the silence and letting the public know, not revealing that he had died for the sake of maintaining the continuity of the band and everything it represented to the public? I mean, that's the sense in which you would suggest they were involved.
No, I mean, were they involved in the creation and maintenance of a public myth? That's what I mean. I don't mean whether Paul died yet. That was my point. We're not going to assume whether he died or not. Just say, were they involved in a myth or maintenance of some for any reason?
But that question doesn't make any sense unless we are missing a player.
Well, hoax. No, that's why I went there. The hoax idea. Most people assume it's a hoax, joke, myth, money ploy. So I'm going to avoid what the explanation would be and just say, can we prove that the Beatles were involved at all in this maintenance? And I won't call it a hoax, and I won't call it a real death.
Then you're, for example, going to appeal to the cover of the Sgt. Pepper album.
Well, actually, no. I'm going to tell people that there are these things that people call clues. They were supposedly discovered or talked about in late 1969 by some U.S. students, particularly one who wrote an article which was mostly out of his own, he threaded stuff together. It came up in DJs, people were questioning things, and most people assumed that was the start of all of it. Therefore, it's a public myth completely from the public and the strange U.S. students. But if it can be proved that the Beatles themselves really, absolutely, for sure, planted any of those ideas in their albums, music, concepts, whatever, then if any of it is absolutely provable, they were involved in that thing, which most people assume was a hoax. So I just want to prove that the Beatles were involved first, that they were part of this, whatever it wasn't just from the students.
Well, tell me exactly what you mean by the myth. You mean they were involved in perpetuating the idea as though it were some kind of hoax or joke that Paul was dead?
I'm not saying they considered it a joke. I'm saying there are two concepts.
I said as though it were.
Well.
See, when you detach and start talking about this perpetuating a hoax or a myth, if Paul is not dead, it has completely different dimensions than if, in fact, Paul was dead.
It does have different dimensions, but I'm trying to say that first we have to determine if the Beatles were involved in anything regarding this idea, or if it came up from the public. Once you know the Beatles were involved in the idea, you can then ask why. At that point, you can posit a hoax. You can posit that he really died. But
all right. So what is the evidence you adduce that they were actually involved? And I take it you're going to say that this young man who wrote this article in 1969 was pointing to some of the indications that derive from the Beatles.
Well, what many people think is he made it up, or people are reading it in. That's what I said. Some people assume it came from the public. I'm going to prove absolutely that the concept came from the Beatles. Okay? It doesn't mean why they did it. It doesn't mean whether it's a hoax, money ploy, whatever. It just means that they were involved in the idea.
Sure, of course, there's a clear distinction between that someone did something and why someone did something.
Exactly. So. Thank you for going there. Okay, so that's what I was trying to say. When you move from the idea it's a pure public myth to it's a hoax, you've made an assumption that it had to be a hoax and he didn't die. But you have at least moved from the idea that the Beatles weren't involved to the Beatles were involved. So I'm going to prove that the Beatles were involved in this public idea. So we're taking it out of a pure myth into something for some reason, hoax, myth, idea, whatever, or Paul really died. But we're not discussing why for a second. Okay? There are 4 provably planted clues, so-called clues, items, in the hundreds and hundreds of thematically closely linked, gory, sad, sometimes strange, but usually quite obvious, supposed clue set. But there are 4 forensically provable ones. I'll go through them. One of them is late, so it doesn't formally count as that they created it, but it is in there. It's from the Free as a Bird video, in the point where they're telling the story of the Beatles' history, and they have a post-car crash set in the 1960s. John Lennon is added into the scene, but that doesn't prove it has to do with Paul. And in the back of the police van, in the window, I'm just going through this quickly because it is 1995, and I know that it does not prove
okay.
their original...
You don't have to go through it quickly. Go ahead.
Well, I want to get to the others. Okay, so the fact is this is late. It doesn't prove the original involvement, but it's just a start to get people thinking. In the back of the police van, in the window, is what seemed maybe to be a leafy reflection in that window. It sort of looks like a Paul-like head that's disembodied and brutalized, like a decapitated head or damaged head, but it's done with sort of a leafy black and white reflection. Fair enough, maybe you're seeing things. The problem is the camera is panning, the van is still, and the leafy reflection is not blurred. Hence, it was planted. So that is an image, like if it looks like Paul and it's like a dead head, and it's to do with the car crash idea, it's Paul because it was planted, okay? That is a late forensically provable optic clue, so-called clue. There are 3 others
Isn't it too early, though, Claire? You're saying 1965.
1995.
Oh, 95. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
it's late, okay?
Thank you.
There are 3, however, early on forensically provably planted clues, 2 of them visual and 1 in text, okay, in which, in 1967, which is supposedly right after the possibility that if this isn't a hoax, Paul really did die in late 1966. In early 1967, there are 3. The one of them is almost unknown. It is a fully frontal O, P, and D on the arm of the gatefold, which is the center piece, of the Sgt. Pepper's album, which most people do not see. Most people have one where it's wrapping around the arm. I don't know where this came from. People might say it's faked, but it's clearly from an old film, and it's a different sized OPD, and it's very natural. And you can see it in the little clip on YouTube from an early Paul is Dead film, probably done in about 1970, it looks like, and it's actually a fully frontal OPD. Maybe it was from, I'll get into what that means. Maybe it was from some alternate press release or something. Some people might call it planted by PIDers. It doesn't seem to be. And the thing is that the patch on the arm, to this day on most people's albums, is an OPP patch. I live in Ontario. OPP is Ontario Provincial Police. There is no such thing as an Ontario Police Department, so it isn't OPD, supposedly, but it is their patch. The problem is it's been doctored. if that fully frontal OPD patch is not a fake from the PID, Paul's Dead crew, doesn't seem to be, then it's an alternate version of what people have on their main pressing of that album. The main pressing of that album, so that's the second clue, but it's iffy if you want to really doubt the Paul is Dead crew and say they faked it. The third proof is the OPD on the arm, which I'll get to. The OPD might stand for officially pronounced dead, which is sort of like a DOA, dead on arrival, or that kind of thing in the U.S. And it's a British version. And the thing is that O and P each have a little dot, a little period beside them in the OPP patch as they print it there. The OPP has gone through different patches, but basically at that time. And the D, or it's debated P, the bend of the P, if it is P, goes all the way down to the bottom of the stem of the P, which doesn't happen in any kind of foreshortening with, that is, any perspective change on a P. You do not get the bulge getting down to the bottom of the stem. So the only way that could actually be natural would be that it's a P, and the dot beside the D is creating, the dot beside the P is creating a D, except you can still see the dot. So and also on a cylinder like the arm, and it's not really a strong, foreshortening on that arm, it's not is that there's no way a P can become a D. That has to be doctored. That's another, as I say, optically forensic proof. You have to understand it is an OPP patch, but it was made to be OPD. That doesn't say why they did it. That's just that they did put OPD on that, their first supposed album after on the Sgt. Pepper, right? The first supposed album after the supposed switch. The other absolutely related to Paul concept provable item, right? There are many items like false mustaches drawn on their faces that doesn't say it's about Paul. The other forensically provable item was actually very early after the supposed switch. It's February 1967, and it's a disclaimer. It's a statement in text. So it's tautologically, meaning self-evidently, about the idea. And what they do is they say, Paul McCartney didn't die in a car crash. So the very concept of Paul, death, and car crash are overtly referred to by the Beatles in February 1967 in Beatles book magazine. It's a disclaimer saying there's a rumor in London, and they put a supposedly wrong date. They deflect the date if it is a false, misleading thing. We'll say they might have misled people on the date. And about 10 years ago now, or 12 years ago, there was an article that came out that claimed that this article writer had interviewed a Moroccan who claimed that he'd been ferrying drugs for Paul McCartney in that January or February, and that this fellow had been in a car crash. The story is absolutely bizarre. He says he left his seatbelt out the car door, and this other car drove over it, and he pulled away, and then he ended up with a light pole between his knees, and he was scratched up, went to the hospital, but dropped off the drugs, was afraid. I mean, it's quite the, shaggy dog story. But if some people will say that was the real event in January. I think it's a cover story, okay? But the real event in 1967 that spawned a real rumor that the Beatles were really, responding to, but that Paul didn't die in late 1966. However, if Paul died in 1966, the disclaimer was probably this is the alternate explanation, the disclaimer was probably because some people were hearing around that Paul might have died. They put in this scenario, they put in a disclaimer, but the disclaimer itself becomes proof of the idea. Years later, like I'm using it to say, they planted that idea, and that idea is in there. Probably not yet knowing what to do with the rumor, and only in 1998, when more people noticed what had happened in this February 1967 Beatle book, somebody hired this guy to come and give a Shaggy Dog story to explain that there really had been. We've never heard from him until 1998, but then supposedly he shows up as this Moroccan student that has this Shaggy Dog tale about delivering drugs to McCartney and the Rolling Stones, never getting paid, having a light pole between his knees and surviving. and that was the car crash. Right? But anyway, my point is that is definitely a planted idea. It doesn't come from a student in 1969 making up a bunch of things he might have heard or might have seen on albums. It's very important for people to realize that this idea did, in the public eye, general public eye, come from the Beatles. It did not actually originate with students in 1969 in the U.S. That's the first thing to assess, right, to get people aware. This is not just people reading things in only, though there are some mistakes.
Well, you would have thought there would be easy ways to disprove it. Just have Paul come out and give an interview, for example, and explain that he wasn't dead.
Well, he did. He always said, well, I'm not dead. Because he's always asked, are you dead?
In 1967, when the rumor was floating.
Oh, well, at that point, there wasn't a big one.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, Claire, that would have been the simplest way to dispatch it. Now, if they have him coming out years and years later, that's a whole different matter. I'm saying at the very time they're putting this item in the Beatles book, it would have been much simpler and more convincing to simply have him give a brief interview and say there's this, rumors of my death are greatly exaggerated. Right,
which he did in 1969 or 70. But I think of course, if Paul died, what it really is they hadn't gotten cagey yet about how to deal with this. They wanted to keep it local. For anyone else who might hear of it, they deflected the date to early 67, and they were disclaiming it, hoping that would sort of go away, and then they began to grieve and put more references to Paul over time in. But my point was that it does stop people saying it was all made up by a guy in 1969 in the U.S. It's very important to get people out of it's purely a public myth. No matter what mistakes have been made by the public, it's not purely a public myth. The Beatles were involved, at least provably, in 1 or 2 or 4 so-called clues. And there's actually hundreds of them that are pretty obvious. Okay, so it's important to just take it out of the realm of pure myth.
Just to anticipate a bit, assuming he did die, and I'm assuming it was probably in a car crash, but that might have been arranged. In other words, it could have been a murder. About when do you think that occurred? In late 1966? And how long do you speculate it would have taken to track down somebody who could be a suitable replacement for Paul? Have there been Paul McCartney look-alike contests in the past?
There was, and the winner was announced, and it was
not the person who would become Sir Paul, but it was somebody. Yeah.
No.
But just looking like him wouldn't be enough. You'd have to have a guy who not only looked like him, but who had musical talent and can sing.
Well, and he wouldn't have to look. To be honest, he wouldn't have to look that exactly like him. What people don't understand is to be a sort of a doppelganger type, you need a few features that under certain circumstances do some similar things, and maybe add a bit of filler to make a little rounder impression or something. And you do some photography to make somebody look a little bit shorter at times.
Well, just to use the other examples we've been talking about, Saddam's double, the one put on trial, didn't look exactly like Saddam, and most certainly
Bin Laden,
the various Bin Ladens, or several Bin Ladens, who really don't look that much like him.
But a lot of people see them as Bin Laden. So my point is, you asked about the date. It is jumping ahead, but I will answer
know.
it.
I'm anticipating and my thinking this through as we go along.
Okay. Well, first, at least I've moved it out of everything is from the public. Okay? It's very important to take that right out of people's mind.
Yeah. But I wanted to recount. Now, when would you think the approximate date would have been if, in fact, this had occurred? In late 66, right?
There are people who have a bunch of different ideas about it. I'm not going to go into why they do. The strongest case, as a total case, is September 11th, 1966. September 11th.
9/11?
September 11th.
9/11?
9/11/666.
Isn't that something? Isn't that something?
Yeah.
Claire,
now,
Claire, you don't have to say more right now because we're going to go to a break. But, we may want to go to your blog or wherever, so when you turn to the forensic evidence. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my special guest today, Clare Kuehn. We're talking about the Beatles, Paul and John. We'll be right back.
We can now say, with moral certainty and considerable scientific authority, that the death of JFK was committed by a meticulously executed conspiracy which was obscured by an extensive cover-up. Murder in Dealey Plaza, edited by James Fetzer, goes to the heart of the JFK assassination. You'll read new and up-to-date information regarding the Secret Service, the Lincoln limousine, the medical evidence, the cover-up, altering the film, framing the patsy, and the silent historians. Also, 16 smoking guns, each one crushing the government's lone assassin scenario. A world-class chronology of November 22nd, 1963. Chapters by David W. Mantic, Gary Aguilar, Vincent Palomera, Douglas Weldon, Jack White, Ira David Wood III, James H. Fetzer, Doug Horn, and a classic essay by Bertrand Russell. The complete story in the pages of one single book, edited by James H. Fetzer. Read it now. Read it again. You'll use it as a reference. Murder in Dealey Plaza. Available at Amazon.com and major bookstores around the world. It's murder.
This is Jim Fetzer, your host, continuing my conversation with Clare Kuehn. We're talking about the Beatles, Paul and John. We may not have a lot of time for John tonight, Claire, but of course we've talked about him before. I would just say I'm a little stupefied that the date would be 9/11, 1966.
Well, let me first make the case that it might be. These, and it's important for people to realize that when we're discussing what might be, none of these are formal proofs of the death. It is very important that people know that I know that, and you know that, because one of the things that came up in the forum and comes up everywhere, and which I do mention on my blog, which we will get to, is that case, proof, clues, theory, evidence can all be used in a tentative fashion, meaning this is my proof of this along the way, this is my case, I'm building a thing, and then you get to a point of a warrant, or is it warranted to ask for direct confirmation or disconfirmation, and that happens in police work.
Let me just say, Claire, that, having taught logic for 35 years, there's an awful lot of failure to distinguish between deductive proofs, which are conclusive, and inductive reasoning, which is inconclusive but nevertheless appropriate, where you have an hypothesis which is supported with probability by the evidence but doesn't make it certain. So I think there's an awful lot of failure generally to distinguish that all empirical reasoning about any event that takes place in the world is necessarily inductive and therefore necessarily uncertain. But that doesn't mean it isn't capable of being established, for example, beyond a reasonable doubt when no alternative explanation is reasonable.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's even forensic evidence is that, but I'm drawing a distinction between the forensic evidence and the so-called clues, which is a further question, which is that within that, which you're talking about scientific doubt of a type that most people don't really talk about doubt, if you're going to use the term absolute proof in an ordinary conversational sense, the forensic side would be that, and the so-called clues and evidence and alibis or non-alibis, what happened historically, is the circumstantial potential case, and you still are building a case with a proof, with evidence, with so-called clues, until you determine whether it's the right one.
I think absolute proof is an inappropriate term to use in any empirical context where we're dealing with what goes on in the world.
But within this context of how absolute is certain types of proof, you build with things that are far less absolute. You call them clues along the way, you call them evidence, and by the time that you get to the point where you say it might hang together, it's a whole bunch of maybes making a bigger maybe. Then you say, I want a warrant to get what is often called the absolute proof. It's not a philosophically absolute proof, but it's given that term in which you can make a determination between that and anything else.
It's a bad use of language, Claire. I would argue
against but I'd like it may be, but I think the audience will understand.
Just call it proof. You don't need the word absolute.
No, because along the way of making a proof for a case, you call it proof, but you may not decide that it is the proof and it's the real case and it's the real evidence.
The term in courts of law, when they're putting together a case, they have multiple examples of proof. They're not individually conclusive. But they are referred to as proof, Claire. So, you don't have
Right.
to be, you don't have to be convoluted.
You do for the audience, because when I say this is a proof of that, I'm not necessarily saying it's the final conclusive proof of the death.
You're not saying in and of itself that this is conclusive. You're saying this is one element that appears to be evidentially indicative and supportive of the hypothesis that Paul is dead.
Right. And when you get to a certain point, you have a warrant that is issued to get further confirmatory evidence that then a lawyer could, let's say, take in and say, I have a formal case. Then it's decided between that and a different proof, a different set of evidence, a different set of reasoning, and a different warrant. That's when we decide on the case and we say, this is the real proof of it, okay? So I'm well aware of that. Anything I'm discussing about the clues or the psychology or the people around it or all that stuff is all along the way as a maybe, okay? And it's a whole bunch of maybes that instead of taking the exit ramp and say, that's not a formal proof, that's not a formal proof, I'm saying it's a maybe, it's a maybe, it's a maybe, it's got to go in the line
You're
of
saying
maybe.
it's evidence, and it looks like it's relevant, and therefore that it makes a difference to the strength of the support for the hypothesis.
But a lot of people don't call it evidence. They don't recognize you can use the term
I understand
tentatively.
that, Claire. You're right about that.
Okay,
which is why
I'm using it tentatively.
teach all these courses, in critical
Okay.
thinking to make people more aware of it. But I understand what you're dealing with.
Okay, so I'm going to call it evidence. I'm going to call it proof. I'm going to call it clues. I'm going to call it a theory. I'm not going to mean that it's formal yet, okay? So if we're discussing the date, there is something which was a fairly clever so-called clue on the front of the Sgt. Pepper album, right after the supposed replacement in late '66, in which, if you put a mirror up to the original lettering, Lonely Hearts, and then Club Band is around the edge of the drum skin on the front of the album. If you put a mirror, it actually, the way they've done the lettering, it actually flips and you get an I or a 1, then you get the word O-N-E, then you get an arrow, then you get he, die, okay? So 11IX, then he, die, okay? So 11 and IX in Roman numerals is 11-9, and the Americans assumed in 1969 that if this was even a hoax or whatever, if it was a clue to the hoax, which they assumed, it would be November 9th, he, die. But UK dating and Canadian dating in number form is day month, not month day, which flips it around. And so that would be September 11th. So that's the first indication it might be, if it was a real death, September 11th. There's another reasoning that would support that. If he died, okay, a year later, Magical Mystery Tour Films started filming on September 11th, 1967. If that's anniversary-like, right, then that would be an indication. Now, Magical Mystery Tour film and album have largely eulogistic so-called clues in them. There's a lot of stuff in that is to do with Paul or Paul as dead and so on. And a year after that, in 1968, on September 11th, John Lennon went into the studio and recorded Glass Onion, which is where he said, there's clues, Walrus was Paul, listen to me, the fool on the hill, he's living there still, and stuff like that. So that's a song about the idea of Paul and death, and even if it's a hoax, you have the date clue in UK dating, you have a year later something that is significant about possibly Paul is dead clues, and a year after that, which suggests that date was intended to be September 11th, not November 9th. There's a third line of argument that it was September 11th, which is that by the time of late 1966, if Paul died, you already had the return of definitely Sir Paul at this point, whether he's a replacement or not. You had his return from France and Kenya. He'd come back, and they were beginning to create Sgt. Pepper's initial stuff in late November. So any replacement wouldn't be taking place in November. That would be absolutely too quick to get a guy and do any kind of surgical changes. And there's a fourth reason, which you may know. If it was a murder, and again, that's a whole other issue that we do not have an exact proof for, but if it was 9 and 11, as most people know, and getting lucky with the date, 1966 would be 1666, if there was a new agey, cultic, gangland intelligence aspect to the death as a murderous car crash or something, then that would be a propitious date to do it. So there are 4 arguments, right? One is the pure date clue. One is the continuance over 3 years to 2 years of anniversary-like behavior. The third one is the timing to get a replacement in a couple of months anyway. And the fourth one is the potential, if it's a murder, of the number numerology stuff. So that's why I say it has the strongest case as the actual date of replacement. Okay? If there was a replacement. You asked about the date.
Yeah. No, that's all good. Yeah, that's all good.
Yeah.
Go for it. Yeah.
So, the thing is, we've moved the case, tentative evidence, tentative clues, tentative proof, over from that it was made up by the students in 1969 in the U.S. to the Beatles were, in fact, putting some things in. We've also determined that there may be a date, a significant thing, or, something that's rather poignant going on. I suppose I'll leave it to you to ask the next question.
Well, you're moving forward on multiple fronts. I gather you want to talk a little more about how deception is a part of all this, and how psychology and group cover-up play in the mind of the doers of all this. I mean, tell me those things or whatever else you'd like to add at this point.
Okay. The fact is that if this was done, it would probably have been posited by somebody else. If this was done, it probably wasn't a wacky idea from them. Joke, you can see. Sustained, mournful, clue-making, probably not, okay? So if there was a real replacement, which again is just one interpretation of this stuff at this point, somebody probably suggested it. They probably had someone in mind, which is another argument that there might have been a murder involved here. And then, of course, people suggest, well, why would he be murdered if there was a murder? Well, if there were, it wouldn't mean the Beatles would figure that out right away. But they would be compromised by such a lie. They probably wouldn't have thought this up themselves, even if it was first done to help them. Somebody may have wanted into the band, been prepping himself for a while, and be proposed. And we know that Paul, or Sir Paul, whoever he is, did take a trip on historical record just fine through France and then Kenya. And Kenya had been a British protectorate. So if there were people willing in a hospital to, a couple of people told what they were doing and keep the thing under wraps, a few agents or people on side, that would be an out-of-the-way place to initially give maybe a lift to a brow and a little bit to the chin and stuff, the plastic surgery idea. But psychologically speaking, John would have had to abrogate personal responsibility for this decision. And in fact, there is quite a bit of evidence that Johnny the Truth Teller ran from problems. He was not, in fact, a truth teller when it was truly
awkward,
truly awkward and almost a fearful thing, right? He ran from certain fights and stuff. He could get violent, but it was more like when he knew he could win. And if they felt, as I said in the beginning, if they felt that they couldn't continue without Polly in the public eye, Simon and Garfunkel without Garfunkel, that does become a problem, okay? So if you had that situation, and somebody suggested it, he may well have said, to swear, fuck it. I don't know what to do. You guys start handling it. I don't know what to do. Be overwhelmed, run to his drugs, his self-pity, and to the movie he was making in Spain, and try to not feel it through while others kind of did it. And at the point of coming back well, I guess, well, whatever. And actually, there's some indication that he actually did try to take a vicarious responsibility and say, well, just don't tell Pete best. So what often happens when people are stressed is they find a different way to take power. It's not really taking control of the whole situation and saying no. It's a kind of a deflectionary tactic. That comes in from one of the issues that's come out in the very modern last few years, that he may have done that. But anyway, so who would have had to know? Well, his family would have had to know, but not all of them. If there's a big, to-do and Paul is almost never home, well, you only have like the father and his son who were of age. The little adoptive daughter wouldn't necessarily know the difference if visited rarely and true. When the father died, Sir Paul did not attend the funeral. He was on tour. I believe that Paulie, at least, would have run home for his father's funeral no matter what. They're very close.
Sir Paul might not have, because it would be too obvious to everyone there who knew him too well that it wasn't.
Yeah, if you stay away, but also there isn't the tie quite, right? It's about double, but it's not a perfect absolute proof or anything, even within reasonable doubt.
You're overly anxious about this perfectly absolute proof. I wish you would just stop using that language. It's obviously relevant and indicative that something is not absolutely normal.
Well,
because
exactly.
a son would attend the funeral of the father unless they were extraordinarily estranged. So that's clearly indicative that this is a nice piece of evidence. And,
maybe, but everything that I marshal, what happens, whether it's on a forum or in a conversation with someone, will say, oh, you think you're just proving it there, and I can just say that has a different explanation.
Yeah, but this is just a bunch of ad hocery. You're pointing out a whole wide variety of considerations and suggesting there's an hypothesis that explains it. What they want to do to defeat you is go to each one and try to give a little ad hoc explanation of why that isn't definitive. But none of this is definitive. What it is you're marshaling evidence that confers a great deal of weight on the hypothesis.
Right, and I call it a whole bunch of little maybes that we haven't determined are a yes or a no, but they don't necessarily become a no.
I would call them
a yes.
I would call them data points.
Fine, okay, but they're a whole bunch of little maybes, and I'm well aware of that. And I want people to know that when I'm going through this, I'm not somebody that's going, here, look, he died.
I got it.
Okay, so basically, there's also the question of the left-handedness of Paul, and some people suggest that a musician couldn't learn left-handed bass and blah, blah, blah. BS. You can't be quite as good, right? But he didn't play for 1.5 years on film left-handed. It's all air guitar, all of them. They all did not play on film for 1.5 years, and when he did play, he played on the piano, okay? Finally played on the piano for the broadcast. Also, they began to wear mustaches. Mustaches are known to be a type of disguise. It does throw the impression off of the person's face.
Sure.
Now, can I just go through this?
Go.
Okay. So, and we know that some of the images, even as early as January 1967, begin to have penciled in mustaches in older photos into Beatles books. So they're already playing around with the idea of a false mustache, right? On Sgt. Pepper's, they have a cutout, false mustache. One of the audio clues is when you play a certain thing backward, it actually says, it was a fake mustache, it was a fake mustache. So whether it was a hoax or not, they're playing around with mustaches. Camera changes, costume changes. They also announce themselves as the Lonely Hearts Club Band. They do not, they do not announce themselves as Beatles on the Sgt. Pepper stuff, right? Beatles is down in the flowers with Paul's left-hand bass on the cover with 3 strings on it, and it looks like a funeral. Also the drum skin we discussed, it says that it's a drum skin designed by Joe F. Grave, who does not exist, and epitaph engraved would make such a name. Now, what happens with these strange ones, these strange sort of ideas, is that people will think, Well, again, ad hoc. Well, that's silly, or that's too weird. The fact is, if you really did have a death, some of it would be clever if you don't exactly want to say so, and some of it would be quite natural. There's a lot of things in there that are quite natural grieving. For instance, in Magical Mystery Tour, and I will kind of jump the gun here and talk as if Paul really did die, in the wizard scenes in the tower, it's little Paulie. He's shorter, he's skinnier, he's absolutely bubbly, his little red nose, and he's being Paul and very effusive. He's a younger man, and it's clearly an interpolation into the film, at least of older footage. It's basically a cameo. It's younger Paul, even if it's a hoax. Younger Paul appearing in a film in which, in general, he looks a fair bit older in that film, okay? It's probably eulogistic. They've managed to put Paul into his film for the last time and stuff like that. Forward clue in the audio is in Magical Mystery Tour in Blue Jay Way by George Harrison, which has a car crash, by the way. A car comes for George Harrison in the video of in the movie. He's on the road and he's about to be hit by the car when it goes to white out at the end. But anyway, he actually, in the background vocals only on the stereo, not on the mono version, the background vocals in the very first verse are, Paul died. Paul is very bloody. And it's fairly clear. It's just diminished in sound. It's a little bit harder to hear, but it's really clear and it's forward. So whatever was going on, it's sad. And even if they weren't covering it up, some of it is, sad and missing, and you probably would find things on their album doing a tribute to their lost bandmate, right? So some of it isn't just odd. But anyway, the psychology is interesting, and he didn't play for a year and a half, actually over a year and a half, on film at all, play the bass. So it's not impossible for somebody to learn a left-handed bass. It's also, he's not quite as rockin' on it. He's out there. He does a nice bass line, but when you hear the original Paul, if he is the original Paul, it's much more bluesy. It's like a bluesy, soft, clever, very... Anyway, there are differences people can hear, but some people don't hear it. So, that's that kind of thing. So anyway, the point is that the alibis historically are not there. In other words, the idea that it couldn't have been done, you do find ways in which it could have been done. And the final thing that should at least make people question it before we get to the forensic evidence is that we have at least 13 examples of very clear use of false ears on Sir Paul from 1967 through to about 1970. It is, again, not a direct proof of replacement. You could do a joke, or he could have had other plastic surgery at age 25, but it is definitely odd that he starts wearing false ears, and it's one of the things that real doubters don't even want to admit or look at, or find extreme ad hoc stretched explanations. Like, well, people have plastic surgery. But it does mean that if he was replaced, it's one of the things they would have needed to do, because ears are like fingerprints. If you have different enough ears, it's a coherent, easy thing to tell if it's different enough. And second of all, scars would have seemed unusual. So it's a thing which, again, isn't a direct forensic proof, but it's very strange that he starts wearing false ears, and it, again, makes that possible. Okay.
He actually begins wearing false ears.
Yeah, some of them have flaps over the cheek, and some of them seem to be like a nice early plastic version that you get an entire line of shadow, right? And I'm not talking about just a general line of shadow across the ear, but a specific line of shadow that goes all the way across the tragus and down to the lobe, and you can see it. Now you have to pause and look, but I have screen grabs of those ones, and there are many photos, which some people had claimed that Paul is dead people had all faked and doctored, but actually the people were quite shocked when they began saying, oh, look, and the ones from the video are very complex. It's not likely to have been faked. And Larry Kuehn, who is a reporter and loved John Lennon and just wrote a book, Lennon Revealed, how ironic, And, so he's doing the interview. And he seems utterly oblivious, and he probably was. Most people wouldn't immediately assume, if they haven't seen someone in a couple of years, that someone walks in and it's their guy. Like, it really is not something that most people would conceive, know, think, dare to totally conceive, and so on. And that's another way that probably not as many people knew. There was one man who has shared that he actually guessed it. It was a DJ from the U.S. named Roby Young, and he became a real Paul is Dead advocate in the 69. He lost his job for actually promoting the idea, I think, in New York City. And he actually said years later that he'd been at a party. He'd been at the engagement party of Paul McCartney and Jane Asher in late 1967. And he said there were all the rockers. There was Paul, looking a little gaunt, looking a little strange. He said, but, he kept thinking, it's really weird. But again, he's not going, oh my gosh, they've replaced Paul, what liars. You don't jump to that usually. And he said then he saw him with this other woman. He was told this is his girlfriend. What? Girlfriend? Linda? What? Linda McCartney, who became his wife. He said, but this is an engagement party. And I think it just tipped him over because it's not like he, you can't be dating a side girl. But he said that's not Paul. It's not Paul. But he still, when he said it, had doubts. Like he couldn't quite think that. I mean, how dare he think that?
Claire, we got to take our final break. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my very special guest today, Clare Kuehn. We're talking about the idea, which many regard as bizarre on its face, that Paul McCartney died. It appears possibly on 9/11/1966 and was replaced by the man we know today as Sir Paul. We'll conclude our conversation when we return. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, concluding my conversation with Clare Kuehn, who is sending me the link to the blog where we can look at some of the forensic evidence, but where, right. Here's the link. I want everyone to go to youcanknowsometimes.blogspot. Okay, this is slightly elaborate, isn't it?
Yeah, and you have to go directly to that link or it gives you an error. So youcanknowsometimes.blogspot.com, and then it gives the date of the post, which is /2013/12. Then it gives the beginning of the name of it. So it's /off-topic-new-is-dead-clue-from-J, because it's going to be John Lennon, okay? So it's from J.html. So anyway, people can go there, or they can go to the main blog page and click to the right and get it, because otherwise they'll get an error. So we were talking about Roby Young, and that people did, at least that's a public example of somebody who wasn't told, but later became convinced when he heard about the rumor later, because he'd sort of been convinced earlier. He just didn't know where to put this experience in his mind. Anyway, we do need to deal with the forensic evidence, obviously. That's very important. So I'll move on to that. There are only a few forms of forensic evidence that could be tested publicly now. DNA would not be provided if there were a death and it was a cover-up. We do have a paternity case where there was DNA submitted and it did not match the woman, though she had an excellent case. And the thing is that, of course, there was no control on that. They didn't compare it to anyone whom Paul definitely was related to. It was just compared between Sir Paul and the woman. Also, you can't get fingerprints. There's no fingerprints available. You could compare ears. You can compare faces. You can compare body heights, but it's not perfect.
Well, Claire, I'm also stunned looking at 3 black and whites you have here. You can compare teeth. I don't see how this could possibly have been the original Paul, because he's got these awful, awful teeth. I mean,
the original Paul did have some awful teeth, but in some pictures it doesn't look as obvious. So they compared. I'll get to that. You can also compare voices. But I found out recently that for a court or a formal comparison, songs do not actually have a formal precedent
Yeah, but plenty of times when he was talking, I mean, like in the movies and all that.
Yeah, exactly.
Go ahead.
So it has to be voice, a spoken voice, and it would cost about $15,000 to $25,000 to get somebody to do it. If they're not willing to do it.
Well, Claire, don't worry about that. I mean, it's with when hypotheses are true, they turn out to be testable in many surprising and unexpected ways. You're talking about additional tests that could be done to determine confirm the hypothesis.
Exactly, but I want people to know how that would work, what is available. You could do that, but it would have to be cleaned up, and it would have to be, you'd have to have an affidavit.
I'm looking at the March 1967 magazine cover, and the teeth appear to be very, very different than the teeth above.
Yeah. So the point is, the point is that we do have an ear comparison, we have face comparisons, and they've been maligned by some people. So we'll just go through it. Whether or not you see a difference, whether or not you hear a difference, is immaterial when one is going to do a proper comparison from photos. It is possible to use photos for certain kinds of comparisons. Some people don't believe it is. But, for instance, if I have Jim Fetzer in many different positions, I can't necessarily prove he's definitely the same guy. But if I have a different man, fully frontal, who's got some similarities to Jim, I can prove he's different. So under certain circumstances, you can use photos. If they're fully frontal, they match each other. They match, a whole series of them match each other for certain kinds of measurements. And then after that point, all those match each other, but the two sets don't match. And
Claire, I just want to interject. Okay, this tooth thing really struck me, and here I'm going down, I mean, not terribly far, and I'm finding a picture where Paul is right in the middle, John's to his lower left, and he's got his mouth open, and it's obvious those are not the same teeth as I was drawing attention to earlier on, which are really ragged and awful. I mean, those are completely different sets of teeth. Completely different sets of teeth.
Right. Okay. So that's.
I mean, that's already powerful evidence that we're talking about two different people.
Yes, I know, but I just want people to understand, if they don't see the faces, how you can tell and how you can use photo evidence, visual evidence. And I'd like to remind everyone that an impression either way can be correct or incorrect. There are people who have very bad facial recognition and think they're great, such as Ed Chiarini of the Dallas Goldbug variety.
God, don't even mention his name. He's a waste. Listen,
no, but I was compared to him.
Claire.
And can I just want to have less.
Go ahead.
Okay. And there are ways to tell, and you can realize that if there is a trick, and you're not told there's a trick. Let's say there's a lounge performance, and it's what do you call it? Not an imposter, but what do they call them? Impersonator. There are some excellent impersonators that if you didn't know, you'd say, well, that was a good performance. That wasn't a good performance. Well, he wasn't at his best, so that was great, right? You wouldn't actually know. And it's also true visually or audially that if there is a replacement, or somebody sort of similar, and they've done some things to him, then you can, in fact, fool 100% of the people, or 99% of the people, most of the time with certain kinds of illusions.
Claire, I just want the proofs.
Not told.
I want the proofs. We don't have a lot of time. I'm disappointed I don't see here the forensic proof from the Italians. I don't see the photos of the comparison of the height of him with the same woman, which are very striking.
Yeah, they're down near the bottom, and I go into it. In 2009, there were two Italians, if to tell the audience. One was a forensic photo analyst, and one was a computer analyst, or I think her son or brother or something. And they, on a lark, decided they were going to disprove this easily. And what they did is they found good frontal comparisons of Paul before the end of 1966, and good frontal comparisons of Sir Paul after. And they found that even when they left a 6% difference for the temple, the bottom of the nose in relation to the eyes, the eye width, the bottom of the chin, the side of the jaw, how high the jaw was, and so on, that all of those things didn't match between the two sets. And they began to keep going. They said, well, that's funny. Well, maybe we better compare the teeth because he's got to be the same guy. They found that those didn't match. They compared the ears. They found that those didn't match. So the point was is that against their wishes, though they did not see the difference personally to start with, they were forced by doing their work to say this has got to be a different guy. But we'd like Sir Paul to comment on it. They didn't want to go and actually formally state it, but they did, and they were interviewed for Wired Magazine Italy. And it was kept in Italy. It's never been formally translated into English. If anyone knows Italian, please do. We have machine translations of it in 2 places. Tina Foster's blog, which is plasticmacca, M-A-C-C-A, .blogspot.com, and also Eric Hausschmidt. But Eric Hausschmidt goes into the fanatical thing that everybody's an honorary Jew if they're a creep. And so his stuff can, it's a diminishment of the case, but he does have a pretty good translation of it there. So basically what happened was a few months after that thing came out, for the first time in many years in English, Sir Paul was asked. He probably asked to be asked about the Paul is Dead issue as a kind of a cover. And he was on the David Letterman show. So he goes into the idea of, well, it's kind of weird. I kicked off my shoes on Abbey Road because it was hot, which is not what you do when it's hot on the road, but anyway. And he says, and then everybody thought I was dead. I thought it was so strange and weird. And he gets the laughs of the audience. And then he slips up. He's trying to say, I'm Paul, right? This is me is Paul, but he ends up saying, well, this is him, right after saying everyone thought that there was a double, but this is him. And he points at himself. It's a slip-up, and very briefly, he looks absolutely afraid. His eyes dart, his tongue licks, he's terrified. Then he realizes that everybody's laughing along, and he begins to kind of laugh with it, and of course it becomes a joke. Okay? This probably was to diminish any rumors of what had happened on the Wired Italia findings. But it hasn't been peer-reviewed. Of course, it's been laughed at. I have comparisons of the outer ears. The Wired Italia people, they compare a little shadow in the ear, and actually I think they've done some adjustments on the ears. So it's not as obvious what they're pointing out. But I point out that the outside of the ear is a totally different shape, and it's not foreshortened, that is, at an angle enough to create any kind of a flattening on the ear. But that one has a very rounded curve on the in the back of the ear. That's the original Paul. And the second Paul has very much of a kinked curve, and it's a wider angle. He's a longer overall back angle. Now, your ears do keep growing. They keep growing in the fleshy bit. They drag a bit, but they do not change their basic cartilage shape. Okay? So these are the kinds of things that whether people want to say, I'm nuts, there's no evidence. Actually, there are some formal points of evidence. There are other lines that could be gotten, like voice-spoken comparisons. But whether you see it or not, lots of people have been fooled. So let's talk about John for a minute.
Well, wait a minute. I don't want to talk about John yet. I want to talk about Paul. Down at the bottom, we got these sets of height comparisons. Those are very important. You got one of him 5'7.5" in 1965, and then you got a guy who's almost 6 feet in 66. Yeah. And those are very important, Claire. And you've got some other height comparisons, and I want to go into that. That's very important.
Okay. They haven't done the height comparisons perfectly. When you take a photograph of someone straight on, actually it's hard to gauge how tall exactly they are. The better comparison has Paul at about 5'10". There is some indication that Paul and John were about an inch shorter than they were claimed because they wanted to boost the sense of how tall they were early on, and they got passports saying they were 5'11". They were probably about 5'10", 5.5", and they were about the same height. Now, if you compare Paulie, the original Paul, with his guitar as an arbiter, and you compare Sir Paul with the same guitar, you get a better arbiter than the way they've done those photos. Just so people know, Sir Paul is probably around 5'11.5", 3/4, 6 feet. Okay, but he's around a little bit bigger than the claim was, and Paulie was probably a little shorter than the claim was, and it puts about 1.5 to 2 inches between them, but not from 5'7" to 6'2". Okay, so I'd like to just
No. Yeah. I'm very into this, Claire. We got to carry this through. You got this comparison, this little GIF that, we have Paul standing beside his father on the right, and then you have Sir Paul with Linda on the left. And I don't know quite how we establish the where the feet are, but it certainly looks as though Sir Paul is taller than Paul.
Right, and you can't establish the feet in that because He might be wearing heels. So
but
again,
in the Italian, they had him with Jane Asher, and before and after, and there was a clear height difference. I'm concerned that they aren't here. Those aren't here. Why aren't they here?
Well, they aren't there because the height comparisons are very complex, and there are some errors in the way that the cameras give an effect. And I will rewrite this darn thing, and it is also unwieldy at the moment because it's going through rewrites. I had some bugs in it. I will go into the minutiae of actually telling that Paul is a different height. But you get certainly enough of an impression that it should at least...
Now, Claire, you've never even spoken yet about John's sketch, which I think is...
That's what I wanted to get to.
Well,
okay?
you've got to get to that. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so that's
go down very near to the bottom of the page is a very good example of it. Yes.
Okay. So, the thing is that in the so-called clues, many things are mentioned. You may have heard of the Eggman. You may have heard of the walrus. You may have heard of the walrus gumboots. You may have heard of the monkey finger and stuff. A lot of this is in Come Together, Over Me.
Yep.
Okay? A lot of people say that's a very strange song, and they think it's sexual, but it's largely filled with gruesome death images, and it does involve a walrus gumboot. Now, if the walrus is Paul, as John says in his clue song, even if it's a hoax, then a gumboot is a Beatle boot. The Beatles were known for wearing little black boots, and they were nicknamed gumboots. It's a type of boot in England. And John did a drawing. Again, this is not a formal proof of death. John did a drawing with a very dead young man standing there like an apparition. He's both dead and alive because he's standing there, but he's got serious head wounds. He's got blood out the top of his head. He's got an egg crack along the
I'd
top.
say that's brains as well.
Yeah, a bloody brain, whatever. He's got a shape out the top of his head. He's got an egg crack along the top. He's got a piece of head sticking up on the side. He's got a split across his eyes that is open. He has wonky eyes, juju eyeballs, strange eyeballs, and swollen little lids. It's very tenderly drawn. It's very considered. And he has very disheveled little boots with all the little zipper dots, which shows caring and consideration. So that would have to be explained if this were a hoax. All this caring, little attention to detail on the little boots, and they're disheveled. So if you had an accident victim, sometimes their boots or shoes are pulled off, pulled away, broken. It can happen if they're thrown from a car or hit on the street or something like that. And I also discovered that, and he's holding a shovel with a freshly dug part in front of him, and he's got a little dog comforting him. So this is a very dead man. Nobody noticed it. It was done privately. It was given already drawn to a private young collector who didn't realize what he may have had. And it is a pièce de résistance of a current American collector. And if it is Paul dead, and I would argue it is, there's no other death that fits that description with Beatle boots and sadness and comfort and disgust. But also it fits the verbal clues, or the verbal statements in the songs. By the way, in Come Together, John starts it off with, shoot me, shoot me, shoot me, shoot me. It's always been seen as very strange. If he's grieving, that would make sense. But anyway, juju eyeballs, walrus gumboots, or gumboots, Eggman, and that sort of thing. Well, I discovered that the actual anatomical aspects of that little slightly simple, cartoony, but very detailed drawing are very accurate to head injuries. If somebody didn't really know anatomy, but they'd seen a man with his head split, the tendency would be to have a damage along the side of your forehead because your frontal bone along your forehead is one piece of bone. So if you're smashed from the side, sorry everybody, it would tend to cut your temple. It also actually goes right across your nasal cavity and that behind your eyes. That's where it ends. I didn't know that. It's not something average people would know, but if you saw a smashed-in head, it would tend to have a problem behind the eyes. He's obviously recognizing, for whatever reason, that there is a smash and split of the forehead behind the eyes. You would get damage to the eyeballs, juju eyeballs, wonky eyeballs, bloated lids. You would also tend to have a split along the top of the head and a piece of the back parietal bone sticking up along the pavement or hanging out. I mean, he's actually drawn anatomically accurate features to a typical head injury that wouldn't generally be, known unless you'd seen it. He's not an anatomist. So this is another indication that this was actually from seeing a photo or a dead man, right? And because of the beetle boots, they've got little heels and they're very tenderly drawn, and it was done privately. It may well have been a personal exorcism of that death, and that he wanted it out somehow 40 years later now, or whatever it is, 1966, it's almost, 50 years later, that I identified that. I mean, nobody else was really discussing it as probably
I think you've done a great job. I've also got Come Together, which I can play now if we allow that to be the conclusion.
I suggest Come Together because it's creepy and it makes the point.
Claire, I think you've done a great job. I can't thank you enough for coming on the show. It's fascinating. I'm sure you're going to get lots of questions, lots of comments, and I can't thank you enough. Jim Fetzer, your host, thanking my special guest Clare Kuehn for being here to talk about Paul McCartney and the thesis many have thought is far-fetched, where there appears to be quite a lot of rather powerful evidence. So thanks, Claire, for being here, and all of you for listening.